At 5:45 p.m. Eastern Time on a Tuesday evening in late July, the United States Military's Central Command posted a short statement that would reignite a war many hoped was cooling down. Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces, it said, had launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iran in what CENTCOM called an attempted surprise attack on American forces in the Middle East. Every missile, the statement claimed, was intercepted. No location was named. That silence was not an accident, and understanding why takes us into one of the least publicized American footholds in the entire region, a Jordanian air base that, for years, the United States barely admitted existed. This is the story of that base, the strikes that hit it twice in 11 days, and the war around it that has now run for nearly 6 months with no clean ending in sight. To understand why a base in the Jordanian desert became the flashpoint, you have to go back to February 28, 2026. That was the day Israel and the United States launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran, killing the country's supreme leader along with a string of senior officials and destroying a large number of military and government sites, according to Wikipedia's running tally of the conflict, corroborated by contemporaneous reporting from major wire services. President Donald Trump framed the campaign as major combat operations against Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. Iran's retaliation was immediate and decentralized. Missile and drone attacks against Israel, against U.S.-aligned Arab states, and against American bases scattered across the region, paired with the closure and later the outright annexation of the Strait of Hormuz in late March, a choke point through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil once passed. On March 6th, Trump posted that there would be no deal with Iran except, in his words, unconditional surrender. That posture set the tone for everything that followed. Within the first 2 weeks of the war, Iranian strikes had already caused an estimated $800 million in damage to American positions, rendering several bases near Iran, in the words of one widely cited account of the conflict, all but uninhabitable. Al-Sadr and Al-Ruwais in the United Arab Emirates, the naval base in Bahrain, Ali al-Salem in Kuwait, Al-Udeid in Qatar, and Prince Sultan in Saudi Arabia were all hit and degraded to varying degrees. By June, the financial cost to the United States alone was estimated at $113.3 billion, with the Trump administration separately requesting $5 trillion for the broader campaign, according to figures compiled in open-source tracking of the war's economic toll. This was not a limited skirmish. It was, by any reasonable measure, a full regional war, and Jordan sat almost directly in its path. One of the clearest illustrations of how far that retaliation spread came on February 28th, the very day the war began. Following the coordinated Israeli and American strikes on Iran, Tehran launched a series of ballistic and drone attacks against the United Arab Emirates, aiming primarily at American assets and bases stationed on Emirati soil, according to Wikipedia's documented account of the episode. Those attacks killed 3 foreign workers, nationals of Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and injured 58 other people. It was an early signal of a pattern that would repeat again and again through the spring and summer. Iranian retaliation aimed at American military infrastructure, landing instead, more often than not, on the civilian workers, contractors, and local nationals who staff and surround these bases. The same pattern would echo months later at Muwaffaq Salty, where American service members, rather than contractors, ultimately paid the cost. The economic shockwaves moved just as fast as the military ones. With the Strait of Hormuz closed and then annexed by Iran in late March, the war produced what has been described as the largest single supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, alongside major disruptions to natural gas, fertilizer, aviation, and tourism industries, and sustained volatility across financial markets worldwide, according to the same Wikipedia tracking of the conflict's economic impact. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil had transited the strait daily before the war began, a staggering volume that essentially stopped moving through that route once hostilities began. When the April ceasefire briefly took hold and shipping traffic picked back up, an estimated 200 million barrels moved through during that short pause alone, according to CNN's reporting, before the blockade returned and traffic slowed again. Regional oil-producing neighbors, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait among them, responded to the initial wave of strikes on their territory by striking back at Iran directly and skirmishing with Iran-aligned non-state armed groups inside Iraq, further widening a conflict that had started as a bilateral confrontation between Washington and Tehran and quickly became a multi-front regional war. Which brings us to the base at the center of this story. Roughly 100 kilometers northeast of Amman, near a town called Al-Azraq, sits a Jordanian-owned, Jordanian-operated facility called Muwaffaq Salti Air Base, sometimes referred to interchangeably as Al-Azraq Air Base. It is not, and has never technically been, an American base. It belongs to the Royal Jordanian Air Force, which has flown F-16 squadrons out of it since 1997. But under a 2021 defense cooperation agreement between Washington and Amman, The United States gained broad, legally formalized access to Jordanian military facilities, and Al-Azraq became one of the quietest, least discussed American footholds in the entire Middle East. Before that 2021 agreement, according to reporting compiled by regional basing trackers, the American presence at the base was never officially acknowledged at all. Investigative outlet Bellingcat first revealed back in 2016 that MQ-9 Reaper drones were flying out of the site, information the Pentagon had not volunteered. For years, in other words, this really was the secret base its name implies, not classified in some formal legal sense, but functionally invisible to the public, tucked into the eastern desert, home to the 332nd Air Expeditionary Wing, running intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, along with strike operations into Syria and Iraq. There's a reason a base like this makes such an attractive target in the first place, beyond the fact that Americans happen to be stationed there. Muwaffaq Salty sits in Jordan's eastern desert with useful open geography and a long runway, a combination that, according to a detailed reconstruction of the base's history published by Migvlug, is exactly what makes an airbase valuable to operate from, and simultaneously exactly what makes it identifiable and targetable from a distance. It has hosted Jordanian F-16 squadrons since 1997 and gradually took on American and Allied aircraft during the campaign against ISIS years earlier, before its role expanded enormously once the current war began. Jordan, throughout this conflict, has tried to hold an almost impossible position: a formal treaty relationship with the United States that obligates cooperation, a shared border with Israel that invites suspicion from Iran and its regional allies, and a domestic population watching a war unfold on its doorstep that it did not choose and cannot easily opt out of. That changed dramatically in February of this year. Satellite imagery and flight tracking data analyzed by the New York Times and separately reported by the Jerusalem Post showed more than 60 American fighter jets parked at Muwaffaq Salty, roughly 3 times the normal number, including 30 F-35s and 36 F-15s. At least 68 cargo planes had landed at the base in the preceding days, ferrying in drones, helicopters, and new air defense systems, among them Patriot batteries and, according to some tracking, THAAD components. A Tel Aviv University-affiliated think tank, the Institute for National Security Studies, was monitoring the buildup in near real time. The quiet desert outpost had, almost overnight, become what the national interest in February called one of the most critical American military hubs anywhere in the Middle East. An estimated 38,100 or more American personnel are now stationed across Jordan, a figure that has climbed steadily since the base's profile changed, according to figures compiled from Council on Foreign Relations regional basing data. The United States has reportedly invested over $143 million in the site since 2018 alone, funding special operations, helicopter capability, and ISR infrastructure. A base that spent most of its life trying not to be noticed had just become impossible to miss. And Iran noticed. Weeks before the buildup was even confirmed by satellite imagery, a pro-regime Iranian lawmaker, Mojtaba Zareh, a member of the country's Foreign Policy Commission, had already begun publicly referencing the American presence in Jordan. According to reporting, captured by open-source trackers monitoring Iranian state and semi-official commentary at the time. Whether that specific commentary directly shaped Iran's later targeting decisions is not something this script can independently verify, but it does show that the buildup at Al-Azraq was drawing attention from Tehran well before the missiles actually flew. There is a human dimension to the July 17th strike that deserves more than a passing mention, because it is easy, in a story built around geopolitics and troop numbers, to lose sight of the individuals involved. As one detailed account of the attack's aftermath put it, CENTCOM's practice of withholding the names of the fallen until 24 hours after next of kin have been notified means that, in the immediate aftermath of an attack like this one, the public record contains only numbers: 2 killed, 1 missing, 4 hospitalized. Somewhere behind those figures are 3 specific people whose names, by the time this script was written, had likely already been released in a formal press statement, but who at the moment of the attack existed publicly only as a casualty count. That gap between the abstraction of a CENTCOM statement and the reality of who actually serves at a place like Muwaffaq Salty is worth sitting with for a moment before moving back to the broader strategic picture. The first major strike on Muwaffaq Salty came on July 17th. Iran conducted what it described as a retaliatory attack, using both ballistic missiles and drones against the base in response to an earlier American bombing campaign. CENTCOM confirmed the following day, July 18th, that 2 American service members had been killed in action while defending against the assault, and that a third was missing. 4 additional troops were evacuated to Jordanian hospitals. 2 were later discharged, while several others were treated for minor injuries and returned to duty. CENTCOM, following its standard protocol, withheld the names of the fallen until 24 hours after next of kin had been notified. A separate incident that same period, on July 18th, killed 1 more American service member in Iraq during a controlled detonation of ordnance from a downed Iranian drone. By July 19th, CENTCOM's running total for that stretch stood at 3 killed and 1 still missing. It was, according to multiple outlets tracking the war, the first American combat fatalities in the conflict since March, a grim milestone that further destabilized an already fragile ceasefire. That ceasefire itself has a tangled history worth pausing on, because it explains why the July attacks landed with such force. On April 8, 2026, the United States and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan. According to the Wikipedia entry tracking the arrangement, and corroborated by wire reporting at the time, it very nearly didn't happen. On April 7th, Trump had warned that, in his words, a whole civilization will die tonight if Iran did not agree to end the war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Hours later, the truce was announced anyway. It was extended repeatedly through the spring, each time at the 11th hour, with Trump at one point warning in May that for Iran, the clock is ticking, and they better get moving fast, or there won't be anything left of them, before turning around the next day and agreeing to hold off on a planned attack at the request of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. That ceasefire ultimately collapsed by summer, and the United States reimposed a naval blockade on Iranian shipping, redirecting, disabling, or boarding dozens of commercial vessels, according to CENTCOM's own figures reported by CNN. It was into that already cracked truce that the July 17th attack on Al-Azraq landed, followed just 11 days later by a second one. That second strike is the one that generated the headline this video opened with. On the evening of July 28th, CENTCOM announced that Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces had launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iranian territory at 5:45 p.m. Eastern Time in what it called an attempted surprise attack on American forces based in the Middle East. This time, the command was explicit that every incoming missile had been successfully intercepted, adding that U.S. forces remained vigilant and at a high state of readiness. Notably, and this matters for the secrecy angle at the heart of this story, the U.S. Department of War, as CENTCOM's parent department is now formally styled, did not identify which facility had been targeted, saying only that the missiles had been aimed at forces based somewhere in the region. It was left to other sources to fill in the blank. Jordan's own military did exactly that. Jordan's armed forces reported that their air defense systems had intercepted 5 missiles launched from Iran, and Iranian state media, through the IRNA news agency, went further, reporting that the IRGC had specifically targeted Muwaffaq Salti Air Base in northeastern Jordan, describing it as the site of a CENTCOM regional command center. In a statement carried by Iran's Revolutionary Guard, the force claimed its aerospace force had, in its words, targeted the U.S. Air Base and the CENTCOM headquarters of the U.S. military in Jordan with several ballistic missiles, warning that further acts of what it called resistance would follow unless the United States halted what it termed illegal and hostile moves against Iran. Open-source intelligence accounts circulating online showed what they described as air defense activity near the base, including Patriot interceptor engagements, though none of that footage has been independently verified by a named news organization. And it should be treated with appropriate caution. CENTCOM's position remained firm and consistent throughout. No casualties, no damage, every missile stopped before impact. Sources close to the Iranian government disputed that account, claiming multiple explosions had been heard inside Jordan and circulating images allegedly showing impact sites. Those claims, as of this recording, have not been independently verified by CENTCOM, by Jordan, or by any Western wire service, and they remain contested. President Trump's response was immediate and blunt. Speaking to a Fox News reporter, he said the United States would be hitting Iran hard, adding that Tehran was, in his phrase, going to get a beating. According to CNBC's reporting on the exchange, he used considerably harsher language in describing the intended American response. Hours later, CENTCOM announced that American and Saudi aircraft had struck what it described as multiple terrorist logistics and weapon sites in eastern Iraq, in retaliation for more than 30 IRGC-directed drone attacks over the preceding 72 hours. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Defense confirmed its participation, describing the operation as coordinated directly with CENTCOM. CENTCOM added, in a statement reported by Axios, that there had been more than 600 attempted attacks on American citizens and facilities in Iraq by Iran-aligned militias between February and April alone, an extraordinary figure that underscores just how sustained this low-grade shadow conflict had already become well before the July strikes on Azraq. The command warned that the IRGC and what it called its terrorist proxies must cease these attacks to avoid further American military response. It's worth sitting with the timing here because it says something important about how fragile the diplomatic track really was. According to Axios, the July 28th missile launch marked Iran's first ballistic missile attack against a U.S. base in the region since Trump had paused strikes against Iran that previous Friday, explicitly to give diplomacy, in his words, another chance. Trump himself had told Axios just 2 days earlier that the United States was in what he called very deep talks with Iran, while simultaneously warning he would return to very strong military action if those talks failed. Asked how much patience he had left, his answer was blunt. Not much time, either it goes fast or not at all. The missile attack landed squarely in the middle of that narrow window, threatening to unravel the pause entirely and forcing the administration to decide, again, whether to escalate. There's an older echo running underneath all of this that longtime observers of the region will recognize immediately, even though it belongs to a different chapter of history and a different set of circumstances. Back on January 28, 2024, a drone attack on a small American outpost called Tower 22 in Jordan near the Syrian border killed 3 American service members and injured at least 25 others, according to CENTCOM's confirmation at the time, as documented in contemporaneous military reporting. That was, at the time, the first American combat deaths in the region since the start of the Gaza War months earlier. It is a separate incident from a separate period under different strategic conditions, and this script is not claiming any direct operational link between that 2024 strike and the 2026 attacks on Muwaffaq Salty. But it is a useful reminder that Jordan, despite its careful diplomatic balancing act, has repeatedly found itself absorbing strikes aimed at American forces on its soil, a pattern that predates the current war by more than 2 years. There's also a more directly relevant precedent from 2025 worth including, because it shows this is not the first time Iran has struck a major American installation in apparent retaliation for a nuclear-related strike. On June 22, 2025, American aircraft and a submarine, in an operation the Pentagon dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer, struck 3 Iranian nuclear sites: the Fordo enrichment plant, the Natanz facility, and the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center, using 14 GBU-57 bunker buster bombs dropped from B-2 stealth bombers, along with submarine-launched Tomahawk missiles, according to Wikipedia's detailed account of the strike, cross-referenced with reporting at the time. The following day, June 23rd, Iran's Revolutionary Guard responded by firing ballistic missiles at Al-Udeid Air Base outside Doha, Qatar, the largest American military installation in that part of the world. According to figures compiled from that episode, Iran claimed 14 missiles were fired with 6 successful hits, while Qatar's own account said 13 were intercepted with just 1 impact. There were no casualties reported by either the United States or Qatar. Iran, notably, gave Qatar and the United States advance warning of that strike, just as it had warned regional partners ahead of its 2020 retaliation for the killing of Qasem Soleimani. It was, at the time, described as only the second direct Iranian attack on an American base, following that 2020 strike. The current war has now produced far more than a second. It's also worth pausing on just how unpredictable Trump's own public posture toward Iran has been throughout this conflict, because that unpredictability is itself part of the story of why the ceasefire kept nearly collapsing before it actually did. According to CNN's August 2nd and 3 coverage, Trump announced on a Saturday that he had personally called off planned strikes on Iran, saying officials from Washington and Tehran would meet for talks later that same day, only for Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Esmail Baghaei, to publicly deny that any such talks were happening at all, insisting Tehran was focused solely on separate negotiations with Oman over safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Baghaei added that the United States had, in his words, violated all of its commitments back in June when the previous ceasefire fell apart. Just 1 day before calling off those strikes, on August 1st, Trump had said the United States was locked and loaded and ready to attack Iran at levels of military terror, strength, and power not seen since World War II, before pivoting, in the same statement, to say he had agreed to cancel the attack for what he called the future benefit of the world and the survival of a successful and prosperous Iran, on the condition that a deal could be reached quickly. That is the emotional and diplomatic whiplash that has defined nearly every week of this war. Maximum threats, followed almost immediately by claims of imminent breakthroughs, followed in turn by denials from the Iranian side that any breakthrough was ever close. It is exactly the kind of unstable environment in which a single missile strike, whether on Al-Azraq or anywhere else, can either be absorbed and forgotten within days, or become the spark that ends a ceasefire for good. Jordan itself has taken sustained fire throughout 2026, not only at Al-Azraq but across multiple sites. According to Wikipedia's ongoing documentation of Iranian strikes on Jordan, the country's Air Force shot down 5 missiles and 1 drone in a single 24-hour period in late March, with 17 separate reports of shrapnel and projectile debris scattered across the country in that same window. On March 27th, Jordan publicly urged Iraq to rein in cross-border attacks by Iran-aligned militia factions operating from Iraqi territory, warning of the risk of further escalation. The very next day, reports indicated that Iran-aligned Iraqi militias had struck 5 separate Jordanian air bases. The Israeli military separately confirmed detecting missile launches from Iran toward the city of Aqaba in southern Jordan, close to the Israeli border. This is a small, geographically squeezed country wedged between Israel, Iraq, and Syria that entered 2026 hoping to stay out of a direct war, and instead found itself hosting one of the most consistently targeted American footholds in the entire region. So where does that leave things right now in the second week of August? According to CNN's ongoing coverage of the conflict, the war entered its 6th month this week, with Trump acknowledging that the United States is, in his phrase, low-keying negotiations with Tehran. Direct talks appear to have stalled. The ceasefire framework agreed back in April is, according to CNN's own characterization from its August 10th coverage, now in tatters. Iran, for its part, is reportedly using the lull to rebuild. Al Jazeera reported on August 4th that Iranian military authorities say they are prepared to resume the war if negotiations collapse again, with an IRGC spokesman, Hossein Mohebi, stating publicly the previous month that Iran's missile production rate had actually increased during the ceasefire period. At the same time, Al Jazeera also reported that Washington has signaled a possible agreement over reopening the Strait of Hormuz may be close, even as Trump has continued to demand what he calls a total surrender from Tehran as a condition for any lasting deal. Just this week, Trump said he would require compensation from Iran as a further condition for talks to resume, according to CNN's August 10th coverage, a demand that Iranian officials have shown no public sign of accepting. There's a wider regional backdrop to all of this that rarely makes it into a single headline, but shapes how officials in Washington are actually weighing their next move. At the same moment, CENTCOM was confirming missile interceptions over Jordan. American diplomacy was also stretched thin, trying to manage a separate parallel crisis in Gaza. According to CNN's August 1st coverage, Trump had announced what he described as a potential breakthrough toward a ceasefire roadmap there, with a U.S.-backed Board of Peace issuing a revised 15-point plan for the territory, even as an Israeli official publicly rejected key elements of that framework the same day, insisting that full disarmament of Hamas remained a non-negotiable precondition. Behnam Ben Taleblu, senior director of the Iran program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, told CNN's Frederica Whitfield around that same period that the broader Middle East crisis was back in what he called a familiar but frustrating place, as Trump weighed further escalation against Iran's energy sites and infrastructure while simultaneously trying to hold together a fragile Gaza framework. Separately, Lebanon's Prime Minister Muwaffaq Salti accused Israel of breaching that country's sovereignty through continued strikes in southern Lebanon, calling it a clear violation of an existing ceasefire there. None of these fronts exist in isolation. Every additional flashpoint in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the Red Sea, where Iranian-backed Houthi forces in Yemen have declared their own shipping blockade, adds pressure to a White House trying to manage several simultaneous crises with the same limited set of diplomatic and military tools, which helps explain why a strike on a single air base in the Jordanian desert can carry consequences far beyond that base's own runway. It is worth being honest about what remains genuinely uncertain in this story, because a great deal of the coverage around it is contested, incomplete, or produced by parties with a direct interest in shaping the narrative. Iran's claim that its July 28th missiles caused explosions and damage inside Jordan has not been confirmed by any Western government or independent wire service. CENTCOM and Jordan both maintain that every missile was intercepted, with no casualties from that specific strike. Footage circulated by open-source intelligence accounts online, showing alleged impact sites and interceptor engagements, has not been independently authenticated. The precise number of Iranian ballistic missiles produced during the ceasefire period and Iran's actual current missile inventory are not independently verifiable figures. They rest on statements from an IRGC spokesman that outside analysts have not been able to confirm or deny with certainty. And the broader question of whether a lasting deal over the Strait of Hormuz and the wider war is close, as some diplomatic sources suggest, or whether talks have effectively collapsed, as other reporting this week indicates, genuinely depends on which day's headlines and which unnamed officials you're reading. This script has tried to flag each of those distinctions as they came up, rather than smoothing them into a single clean narrative. Because the honest answer, right now, is that nobody outside a small circle of officials in Washington, Tehran, and Amman actually knows which way this goes next. What we do know, with reasonable confidence, backed by named sources on the record, is this. A Jordanian air base that spent most of its operational life trying to stay out of the news became, over the course of 6 months in 2026, one of the most heavily reinforced and most frequently attacked American military footholds in the entire Middle East. It absorbed 2 direct Iranian strikes in 11 days in July alone, the first of which killed at least 3 American service members and left a 4th missing, the second of which, according to every American and Jordanian source available, was fully intercepted without loss of life, even as Iranian sources disputed that account. The base sits at the intersection of a war that has already cost well over $100 billion by the Trump administration's own accounting, disrupted a fifth of the world's oil trade at its peak, and killed a supreme leader along with a war's worth of soldiers, militia fighters, and, tragically, civilians on multiple sides. And as of this week, the diplomatic path out of that war looks, by the administration's own description, low-key, stalled, and uncertain, while the military that fought over Muwaffaq Salti Air Base reportedly rebuilds its stockpiles in the meantime. Before wrapping up, it's worth naming plainly where this script's information came from, because that transparency matters more in a story this contested than almost any other kind. The core facts on the February 2026 outbreak of the war, the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, the closure and annexation of the Strait of Hormuz, and the overall cost of the conflict come from Wikipedia's continuously updated entries on the 2026 Iran war, cross-checked against wire reporting. The details of the July 17th and July 28th attacks on Muwaffaq Salti Air Base, including the CENTCOM casualty statement, the Trump administration's retaliatory strikes in Iraq, and the 600-plus prior militia attack figure, are drawn from CENTCOM's own public statements as reported by Axios, CNN, Al Jazeera, CNBC, RT, Iranwire, and The Aviationist, along with a detailed reconstruction published by MIGFLOG. The history and buildup of the base itself, including its previously unacknowledged status before 2021, the Bellingcat drone revelation, and the February 2026 satellite-confirmed troop surge come from the New York Times reporting as relayed by the Jerusalem Post, the National Interest, Council on Foreign Relations basing data, and a detailed statistical breakdown published by the Global Statistics. The 2025 Al-Udeid Air Base strike and Operation Midnight Hammer details are drawn from Wikipedia's dedicated entries on those events, corroborated by Wall Street Journal and Guardian coverage of the Diego Garcia and Gulf strikes from the same period. Worth noting separately because it belongs to the same broader pattern even though it falls outside Jordan entirely. In March 2026, Iran also launched missile and drone strikes against British military facilities that were supporting the American war effort, hitting locations across 3 separate regions: Cyprus, the Indian Ocean, and Iraq. British forces on the Indian Ocean atoll of Diego Garcia, a joint UK-US base, were targeted with ballistic missiles, according to reporting from The Guardian and the Wall Street Journal from that period, with the UK's Foreign Secretary publicly condemning what officials called Iran's reckless threats following the strike. That episode isn't part of the Jordan story directly, but it underscores that Muwaffaq Salty was never an isolated case. Iran spent much of 2026 systematically testing the air defenses and political resolve of nearly every country hosting American or allied forces within missile range, from the Gulf states to the Eastern Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. And Jordan simply absorbed more of that pressure and more direct American casualties than almost anywhere else. The current diplomatic state, including the collapsed ceasefire, the naval blockade, and Iran's reported missile production increase, comes from CNN's and Al Jazeera's ongoing live coverage through early and mid-August 2026. Anything not tied to one of those named sources in this script, including unverified Iranian claims of damage at Al-Azraq and unconfirmed open-source video, has been flagged as such rather than presented as settled fact. There's a broader question sitting underneath all of this that's worth thinking about past the headline. For years, the United States quietly built out a presence in Jordan that it never fully acknowledged, right up until satellite photos and flight logs made the buildup impossible to hide. Once it became visible, it became a target, twice within 11 days. Is that the cost of transparency catching up with strategy? Or was the base always going to be found and struck regardless of how quiet Washington tried to keep it? And with talks between Washington and Tehran now described by the president's own team as low-key, and Iran openly saying it's rebuilding its missile stockpile in the meantime, do you think a lasting deal over the Strait of Hormuz is actually close? Or is this simply the pause before a 7th month of war neither side has fully committed to ending? I'd genuinely like to know what you think happens next. That's where we'll leave it for today. Thanks for watching.